we finished the last part by looking at how simulations were running or how our rather silly simulation box was ran as we increased the number of cores. And you'd all very astutely noticed that yes, the time increases smaller as you increase the core count, and that kind of makes sense. That's what you'd expect. But more unexpected is that at low core counts, you get terrible performance improvements, especially when jumping from 1 to 2 cores, and you wouldn't expect that. So I guess that that's the perfect jumping off point into the next bit that we'll be talking about for the first half of this session, which is domain decomposition. And domain decomposition is, I mean, it's a fancy way of saying, how do you split up a problem? Or what method do you use to split up a problem across multiple cores or across multiple processors? The two words are used interchangeably. I've tried to stay with core meaning core, but yeah. So, okay. How do you split up the job? There's loads of different ways that different systems will split up jobs. So for instance, there's I've seen systems where they're time independent, do certain part of, simulate a certain part of the timeline on one processor and then a different part of the timeline on another one. And that's absolutely fine. But this isn't the case for a molecular dynamics software package like LAMMPS, where what the next frame looks like is incredibly dependent on what the current frame looks like. So the way that most molecular dynamics packages perform domain decomposition, the way that most packages split the work across all cores, is by using what's called spatial decomposition. And essentially, that's exactly what it says on the tin. You have your simulation box. Let's look again at our terrifyingly terrible simulation box, and you kind of split it up. If you're running on 2 cores, you split it down the middle and give 1 core the left half, 1 core the right half. If you're running on 4 cores, you split it down the middle and along the down the middle and sideways down the middle, and then you give each core 1 part. If you split it in 8, then actually the way LAMMPS does it is it only ever splits along a single plane, usually the XY plane. So if you split it in 8, you split kind of like down the middle, and then you will end up with down the middle, on the middles, and then sideways to create sort of like large elongated blocks, which I think the LAMMPS developers refer to as pencils. Because if you really increase your number of cores, they end up being like super thin blocks with hardly anything in it. But that's how LAMMPS decomposes, at least by default. And with a box like this, if you just split it down the middle and give the left half to 1 core and the right half to the other core, well, guess what? The core that gets the right half has got all of the atoms in it, and the core that's got the left half has got nothing in it. So one of those cores will be doing all the work, at least at the start, and the other one will be doing nothing until your system sort of equilibrates and all of the particles in the system end up evenly distributed, which will happen eventually, right? Thermodynamically, it will. But until that happens, we'll end up with a huge imbalance, the amount of work that one processor does versus another. And that imbalance, while it's not visible if we go back to our timings, you'll notice that you do get an increase in speed from like going from 64 cores to 128 cores. Which makes it look like everything's okay, but actually it isn't. You can still end up with having about half of your cores doing nothing. As long as the other half of your cores, like if you increase the other half of your cores by 2, you'll have twice as many cores to work on the problem you're working on. Which means you get something that looks like an increase in, like an improvement in time. Actually, you could be nearly doubling it, considering how you split the work across your processors. I hope this makes sense. This is, because this is kind of the crux of domain decomposition. And The LAMMPS default actually works. The reason it's the LAMMPS default is because most people will run systems that are roughly uniformly distributed in space. So you'll have roughly the same number of atoms in, say, the bottom left corner of the box as you will in the top right corner of the box. When that isn't the case, all of a sudden it becomes something you might want to reconsider, to look into. So that's a quick crash course into domain decomposition. Now, is there anything that LAMMPS can do, or what can LAMMPS do to help us with this? Actually, LAMMPS is really good at providing options for domain decomposition. All of the options are easy to understand, and as we'll see soon, can provide pretty decent speedups when used in the correct fashion. LAMMPS offers two ways of improving the way that the system is split across the course. There is the balance command. What the balance command does is at the start of the simulation, it will sort of look at the entire system and then split up the tasks as evenly as it can amongst the cores, and it will never do it again. So you kind of split it up at the beginning, and then you never split it. You never check again to check that all of the processors have got the same amount of work. That can be quite useful if you're simulating a system that, say, has a surface which has way less atoms than and I don't know, I'm making this up, but then say a liquid or a gas that's near the surface. Or, like where one part of the system just ends up being much more dense and will stay more dense because it's not allowed to melt or to evaporate. If your system's going to fluctuate in density throughout your simulation, that's not going to do much good because it's a one-off improvement. If you split it at the start, but then everything ends up being non-uniform further down the line again, all of a sudden you can still very quickly end up in that situation where you've got some processors doing way more work than others. So for that case, for that scenario, LAMMPS offers a second way to consider balance, to rebalance your system. That's the fix balance command. That's the one we'll be using today. Because effectively what we've got in our system is we've got a sort of like slow evaporation of ethanol. I realize that it's not a solid, so it's not quite an evaporation. I guess it's more an expansion into a larger volume of ethanol. But we'll be looking at the fix balance command because our system progresses. We hope that our ethanol will spread to all corners of the box. Probably in the time we've given our simulations, that's not going to be the case. But as it does that, we do want to make sure that core is still doing about the same amount of work. One of the questions is, if I understand correctly, LAMMPS assigns a slice of the simulation box to a core. Yep, that's exactly right. So, see, on the left-hand side of the picture at the bottom here, you've got the default. So this is a 2D representation of what LAMMPS does. But as I said before, because LAMMPS only decomposes in 2D, you can imagine that the system sort of like shoots off in the into the page, into my screen, or into your screen if you're looking at this on your screen. With no balance command, LAMMP will simply put your box into a number of equal parts, but based on volume. If you use a balance command, there's two types of balance commands that LAMMPS offer. First one is a balance command called shift. What shift does, it still uses blocks. You notice, for instance, if you go along this y-axis, all of the blocks here end at the same point in the y-axis, and all of the next blocks end at the same point in the y-axis, etc. And essentially, you're still making blocks. You're splitting those blocks of varying sizes. So say this block here is a very different size from, say, this block, amongst the processors. And when you split them, when you work out how to split them, you work out, well, how much work, i.e. how many atoms, does each block have? You try to balance that as much as possible. You try to make sure that each processor has roughly the same number of atoms. But however, in this test case that LAMMPS is using, you'll notice that block doesn't work very well because you still end up with 2 blocks doing nothing, which is equivalent of having 2 of your 16 processors sitting idle. Again, isn't good, but it's better to have 2 sitting idle than the 6 odd that you had here. So the shift balance can be quite useful in a number of systems, but probably is not the most useful in this one. The other one that you can use is one called RCB. And RCB is a tiling type command. And what that does is, instead of keeping to structured set blocks that are, like each block along a line will start on a given y position, and each block for the next one up will start on a given y position. Instead, it sort of like tries to create tiles. Each tile has the same number of atoms, regardless of volume. You end up with these sort of like mosaic style things, where you end up with like one massive box, which has not the same number of atoms, this much smaller box here in the corner. And that can be much more useful, that can be much more effective. However, when you use the advantage of shift balance, because obviously now the question is, well, if the tiling method, the advantage of the shift method over the tiling method, if the tiling method is better able to run your simulations like this, why would you not use it? Why would you ever bother with the grid type method? Well, the reason is because communications is much more easy with the grid type balancing command. So as I said, each processor is assigned one of these boxes, the grid. Then it runs simulations. When you run simulations, your atoms are going to move. I mean, hopefully your atoms are going to move. Otherwise, why are you bothering, right? As your atoms move, they can cross boundaries. And so they can cross the boundaries from one processor to another, from one core to another. And when you do that, to keep track of it, you need some communication. You need some form of communication. You need the processor on the left to say, hey, I'm sending you an atom. And you need the processor on the right to go, okay, I'll take it. With a grid type balancing, it's much more easy to keep track of which core is assigned to which part of the grid. Whereas with a tiling type balancing command, all of a sudden, you can have some grids, you can have some cores are looking at a region, like let's take the top right-hand corner one here. This has along its left-hand side, it's meeting 1.5 other core domains. So keeping track of where the atoms are coming from becomes a bit more complicated. And so you need to consider how you're communicating. So you need to change your communication methods. That can have an extra cost. So yes, the main takeaway from talking about balance is the following. If your system is not uniformly dense, or if you suspect that your system will not remain at a constant uniform density throughout, you should look at balancing. But if you get to that stage, it is always worth taking a small dummy system, even like running your system for a small amount of time, and seeing which one fits best for you. So now we'll move on to our first exercise in this section, which is very simply, let's run some balance commands. Let me change screen sharing. While I'm changing screens, please let me know the questions you have from that, because I realize there's a lot to take in there, and balance is a super strong method to use, but it can have, and it sort of takes a while to get your head around. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to answer them. So if you look at your slurms, I'm going to clear. Here we go. If you look at your in.ethanol file, you'll notice that, I mean, we can take a bit of a bigger look into this. I've not really looked into it too deeply. You'll notice, first of all, this line here is where I set the box to be 8 times as big as it needs to be. The first thing I would say is if you were wanting to run this in a sensible fashion, change that to have 0 to x length, 0 to y length, 0 to z length. But this is not the purpose of the exercise. It's more like further down the line if you wanted to use this for your own tests. Then we kind of define all of the pairs, bonds, angles, and dihedrals. Find the neighbor list. We'll talk about those in a sec. And right here on line 110, there's a fixed balance command that's commented out. You'll notice that I'm using the shift. This number here tells you how many time steps you wait before, what's the word I'm looking for? Before you recalculate, like you rebalance your system and change how your blocks look. This tells you the tolerance. So I'm saying I'm happy for the balance command to end when the processors are all within 5% of one another. Yeah, I'm happy with that. And then you say what type you want to use. In this case, it's the shift. I'm shifting along, I will be calculating along the XY plane. You can choose the plane you want, depending on your system. I want no more than 10 iterations to get to that 1.05. If you uncomment that, and then I would say run it on 128 cores because that's the easiest. Sorry, I changed my thing a bit. Here we go, and I think you've also got CPUs for task 1. Lock that out. But yeah, if you edit it, if you uncomment that line, then run slurm command. Let's see whether it runs faster, first of all, and if so, how much faster. It's happily running. I heard there were a couple of questions. Ooh. So one is a comment. There's just one issue: balance, shift, and RCB. As the sum volume assigned to each core changes, it happens that LAMMPS assigns subvolumes that violate the cutoff conditions. This happens when too many processes are used for too small a number of atoms. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But that kind of makes sense. Like as soon as you have too many processes running your system, I mean, frankly, you should be using less because it becomes very inefficient to do so. Is there any difference when you are using non-orthogonal boxes? To be honest, David, I've never tried that. Look into it during the break and get back to you. Is that okay? And the final question is there a way to know the best way to make sure you to make use of your fixed balance before running a simulation? I would want to use them in a system with rapidly changing density. How can I know what the optimum rebalancing frequency is and what the additional computational overhead of rebalancing is? That's an excellent question. And that sort of question, the answer I'm going to give is pretty much consistently the same. Make a test system, try it out. Make sure your test system is either smaller and runs for a bit less time, or much, much shorter. In this case, you'd want smaller and runs for a bit less time. But then try it out, like see how much difference it makes. Quite often, the simulations that people are running on Archer 2 take order, tens of hours. And if you're going to be waiting for your simulation to finish in 10 or 20 hours, taking 1 hour to run a series of 5-minute simulations give you so much information. It'll make your later bigger runs go so much faster that you'll end up saving a lot of time. So always do small performance tests first. The other thing is, and we'll see this for this system in a sec, quite often I guess the other way you can predict it, if you want a more how do I back of the envelope it, is you should be able to know, or if you know the what's the word I'm looking for? How quickly your atoms move. Um, I forgot the word. Um, anyways, but if you can tell how quickly your atoms are likely to move a certain distance, you can work out how likely they are to cross a boundary. And only when enough of them have likely crossed a boundary, or only when one of the areas is likely to be empty, those are the points where you don't want to rebalance much more than those times. You are absolutely correct that there is an additional computational overhead to rebalancing, and that is something to take into account. You don't want to rebalance every time step, but you also don't want to rebalance every 3 nanoseconds if your system is going to fluctuate over 100 picoseconds. So my job is finished. Before we look at the results, this is always scary, like, if I got something wrong, this will be scary. It looks like we were running in about 48, 49 seconds beforehand. Now, running in 26. There you go. With one balance command, we've halved the time it takes to run these simulations. And actually, I did some tests earlier. I've done some tests earlier, and in this case, as you've probably all guessed from my description of the two things, you can actually drop this a further about 10 seconds if you use the tiling RCD method on 128 processors. So I think now we've got a small exercise, which is to let you play around with this. And one of the exercises is actually to test out what happens when you use when you change how frequently you rebalance your system. So let me show what I'm sharing again. Here we go. So if you want to take the next 5-10 minutes to try out these two exercises, and we'll go through them in about 5-10 minutes, and then chat a bit about Neighborlist, because that's another place where you can save a ton of time. 10 to the 7 time steps. Does it make any sense to perform test runs that only run for 1,000 time steps? That's a very good question, and I mean, it kind of depends what the answer is, it depends on what you're trying to get from those 1,000 time steps. There are certain things that you can find out using 1,000 time steps. Like, for instance, the exercise we did before the break of running on more and more cores. Well, if you're getting a noticeable improvement, a noticeable speed up in 1,000 time steps, you'd expect that to correlate to billion time steps. And actually, that's a great way of very quickly checking whether it's worth throwing more resources into it before you end up having a ton of resources sitting idly. With regards to rebalancing specifically, well, first of all, before you even rebalance your system, you have to, and before you take any steps, usually, you need to sort of think and try to understand your system. And it fluctuates, how it moves, how it's likely to evolve. It's likely to have sections that sort of like suddenly evaporate and sections that sort of suddenly coagulate. And then having an idea of how quickly those happen will let you know what sort of scale you want to be rebalancing on. If that happens in the order 1,000 time steps, then yeah, you definitely should consider doing it. If it doesn't, then even just thought about how quickly these fluctuations happen can help you determine how frequently you want to rebalance. The other thing I want to say is the rebalancing calculation will, unless you're doing it every time step, it will not be a massive overhead. If you're doing this calculation every 1,000-ish, 10,000-ish time steps, it will not dominate your simulation calculation time. In fact, depending on your system size, I've found like a couple of systems where one of the things that every so often would influence the time step was just writing. The time it took to output was huge, and there was a huge spike in runtimes. But so I hope that answers your question. How can I use the tiling method? I get an error. That's an excellent question. To use the tiling method, you need to, at the very start of your script, write com. I'm doing this from memory, so I might get this wrong. Com style tiling. Google it just now. Do you know in chat, by the way, if you're getting any? Oh, it's tiled rather than tiling. I wasn't far off. Do let me know in the chat if you're getting interesting results and whether you're noticing a wide difference in how quickly simulations run when using, when you're using a fixed balance, and if you're recalculating the balance every 10 time steps versus hundreds versus thousands. The question is, would static one-off balance be effective here? And I kind of give the answer away in my initial talk, which is it really wouldn't be because, because as you run through time, your partner are going to move from that initial position, and that means that every section, especially if you're using the block command, every block will end up having a different number of particles, and you want them to be about even. So it's better to use the fixed balance than balance in this case. And then the question is, we've done it 3,000 time steps. So what did people get? How does the runtime change as you vary the frequency at which you're calculating the balances? So someone is saying they didn't notice much difference between the fixed balance and the balance command. And actually, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And part of the reason for that is because of the question I answered earlier. We're not calculating the system for anywhere near long enough for the items to uniformly populate the box fully. If we were to run the simulation for a much longer time until it reaches equilibrium, then you would notice that once it reaches equilibrium, and even in most of the lead up to equilibrium, you would get a much more noticeable and pronounced performance difference. Yeah. So there's a few seconds difference between using 10, 100, and did I say 10,000? Fair enough. I didn't even bother trying 10,000. That's about right. That's what I would expect. Some of them are slightly better, some of them are slightly worse, which kind of indicates that we're still nowhere near where we need to be. For 8 processors, you get a speed up of about a third, or no, sorry, a speed up of 2/3, which is what I would expect again, because at 8 processors, you have a much more pronounced. It's one of the weird things, because this is quite a small system. At the end of the day, it's an what is it? It's a 5,000-ish atom system. That's really quite small. So running that on 8 processors, if you divide that evenly and well amongst 8 processors, so that each of them has about 1/8 of those 5,000 atoms, you'll get a much more significant performance increase than if you were to split amongst 128 processors 5,000 atoms, because in that case, each processor is going to have not many, about 50 atoms each, and so it's not going to be as noticeable a difference. But at 128 processors, there's hardly any difference. But it's great if you tried at 8 processors. And if you were to try, I wouldn't recommend it because it would take a while, but actually you can drop, if you try on 2 processors, it drops pretty significantly to 5, I think, minutes, but I can't remember off the top of my head. The time varies drastically based on the number of processors you're using and how often the rebalancing is carried out. When you use dynamic rebalancing, there's an important trade-off between the time that you gain from the rebalancing and the cost involved there. But as I said, the cost is actually pretty minimal. Someone is saying that they got an error in their so someone is saying that they got the max submit job per user limit. We are submitting jobs to the short queue, and there is a maximum number of jobs that you're allowed to have in the queue at the same time. I can't remember, I think it's 4, but I might be misremembering. So if you have more than 4 jobs in the queue, you won't be able to submit anymore, and that's probably why you're getting this error message. That answers the question. Yeah. So okay, that's load balancing, and for our test system, it has made a huge difference. So let's move to the next thing, which is talking about neighbor lists. And neighbor lists is actually going to be a great opportunity to chat a bit about the profiling information that that LAMMPS outputs. And after every single run command is complete, LAMMPS will output this information, and it's always worth checking out because it gives you a ton of information. If your job is going well, the pair section should dominate. So you should spend most time in pair. If running on more processors than is good for you, then will dominate. And that's a great indication of you're using too many processors. You should reduce the number of processors is when you spend more time in communications than in anything else. Because that means you spend more time waiting for your processors to talk to your cores to talk to one another, or your node to talk to one another, than you do doing actual calculations. Other ones that can sometimes creep up are K-space. As you run larger and larger systems on a larger and larger number of nodes, and their cores, your K-space time can greatly increase. And when that happens, we'll talk very briefly about a method of mitigating that in a sec. But it's basically to do with the way that LAMMPS decomposes the K-space calculations, means that you get a small overhead per core you're using. And that means that if you're using a ton of cores, your K-space is going to take a long time, and you don't want it to. The final one that might be interesting in this one, which is for us the dominating one, is which is how long do we spend doing lists? And in this, we spend 60% of our time, roughly, building neighbor lists. I think this was on a single processor for, on a single core for the ethanol job. So 60% is terrible. If we look at, I'll just really quickly look at the run I just did on 128 cores. A bit better, but it's not great. Let me. So I don't need to share actually for this, but yeah, we spend about 40% of our time and more time than anything else building neighbor lists. So that's not excellent. Probably want to look at. So I've kind of just said here that if you're running a sensible simulation, if your timings are correct, then your neighbor time shouldn't be much more than the 10 to 30% region. Your K-space time shouldn't be much more than the 10 to 30% region. Your COM should never dominate, and your pair style should dominate. That's the ideal. If you've got all of those, then your simulation is performing well. But how do you reduce these? Because it's nice to say this is what you're aiming for, but if you don't know how to change them, that's not helpful. And we'll talk about the nay command first. We've talked about how to reduce the comms command, or the comms time. But for the neighbor time, the way that you do this is by playing around with your neighbor modify and your neighbor commands. So, quick show of hands, how many people, Could you let me know if you already know what neighbors lists are? Or rather, could you let me know if you would like me to tell you to explain what a neighbor list is and how it works by putting a hand up? Yep, at least one person, so I'll describe it. So quite often when you're running simulations, part of your simulation will have a short-range interaction. At least for atomistic systems, that's usually the case. You have your van der Waals, which are simulated using short-range interactions. And those short-range interactions will die off and tend towards zero after a certain distance. And usually to speed things up a bit, we'll set a cutoff for them. And you'll kind of say, well, any particle that's outside of this cutoff will have an interaction of zero, will have no effect on the particle for which you're currently calculating. But part of the problem of doing this is that you never really know when a particle will pass into or out of this cutoff, which means that if you're not being careful about it, what you can end up doing is calculating at every time step the pairwise interaction for every single pair of particles in your system. And every pair of particles in your system goes as order n squared over 2. And that can take a long time, especially if you have a lot of particles. So what the neighbor list does is it introduces a way of calculating these short-range interactions, but only considering the particles that are a close enough range that they have a probability of making it into a short-range interaction cutoff. And so what this diagram illustrates is you've got your short-range cutoff on the inside, and then you add a small little delta to it, and you, well, every particle that's within this neighbor cutoff distance, I will keep in a list. And for the next couple of time steps, when I calculate all of my interactions, instead of calculating my interactions with every other particle in the system, or range interactions with every other particle in the system, I will only consider those within my neighbor cutoff. And after a couple of time steps, I'll recalculate my neighbor cutoff to check whether any new particles have entered, whether any old particles have exited. Then I'll keep doing that. So this has a couple of advantages. The first major advantage is that all of a sudden, you're not calculating interactions with every other particle. You're not doing n squared over 2 calculations. You're doing a much, much, much more small number of interactions, which is excellent. The second advantage is, oh, sorry, that's my thing. The other thing as well is because you're doing this, you can get a huge speed up. It also means that you can run much bigger systems at a without having that sort of like self-dependent slowdown quite as much. So actually, technically, in most cases, you're able to get from double the size of your system without Neighborlist, it'll take 4 times as long to run. But if you use Neighborlist, it'll take roughly twice as long to run because you'd expect that the number of atoms per Neighborlist is going to be the same. So you're doubling the number of atoms. So it'll take twice as long, which is excellent. But the downside to neighbor lists are, again, twofold. The first one is there's a cost and overhead to calculating them. So if you calculate them too frequently, you're effectively, the more frequently you calculate neighbor lists, the closer you are to effectively checking how often, to not bothering with them, essentially. So if you don't, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you update your neighbor lists too frequently, i.e. if you calculate who your neighbors are too often, then you're not getting any speed up from it. You might as well just be checking the whole system against itself, which is not ideal. But then there's the other problem, which is that if you don't check your neighbor lists frequently enough, then you run the possibility, the risk of a particle outside your neighbor list making it into your short-ranged interaction cutoff, and that will crash your system and also cause very terrible physics. What if you use neighbor-style multi? If you have a lot of small particles, is it bad practice? Should it only be used if you have a gap-graded material? That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to. I've never used the multi command before, so if it's okay with you, I'll look it up for the break and I'll get back to you during the break. Is that okay? Cool. Okay. If you look at our in.ethanol file, you'll note that there are two lines that say a lot about the way we're handling neighbor lists. The first one is we have a variable at the very top, which is called natetime, which is equal to 1. And then we've got the nameModify command. And what that says is the one you're interested in when you've got delay 0 is the every here. That tells you how many time steps you wait before the neighbor list builds. So if you every one, that means that every single time step you rebuild the neighbor list. And if you want to actually, yeah, there's probably enough time for this. If you want to take about 5 minutes, you can edit the in.ethanol file and change the natetime from 1 to 10 and then to 1,000, and have a look at what happens. Like, does the simulation speed up? Does it slow down? That sort of thing. So if everyone wants to take 5 minutes to do that, I'll come back in 5 minutes with the answer. And as always, do let me know your questions. List rebuilt every 10 time steps rather than 20 time steps. If you had something like delay 10 every 5, then delay 10 says don't build unless there's 10 time steps, which means you'll still only get an every 10 a rebuild every 10 time steps. Wall time fix balance RCB and neighbors is, yeah, seconds. That's about what I'd expect. Which, you know, considering our first simulation on a single core took 8.5 minutes to run, that is, I'm going to say that's a pretty good improvement in our time. Run the script with fixed balance with shift and RB, and RCB takes a bit longer. Is this expected? That depends on a lot of things. So it depends on your system size. It also depends on the frequency at which you update your balance. So if you update it every 1 time step or every 10 time steps, then you start to get into that region where you're getting an overhead of recalculating your balance command, so they will be very similar. But if you're looking at 100 or 1,000, then you'd expect, or I would expect RCB to be better. With fixed balance, RCB, yeah, and neighbors 1,000, it takes longer, and that's yeah, that makes sense anyway. One comment is, I always thought that the check yes option is a good way to mitigate the cost of more frequent rebuilds, though through a smaller natetime. The manual says the check is very quick and inexpensive, and that LAMMPS will only rebuild if necessary. I've explored that. That's a very interesting thing to bring up. What does check yes do? But I mean, let's be absolutely honest. If the manual says it's a good idea, I do not disagree with the manual, because the manual is written by people who know much more about this than I do. Yeah, I mean, check ensures that it's following your delay in every command, so that makes sense. In line materials, where neighbors are basically constant, I'm assuming that updating neighbor lists does not make much sense. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. If you expect that your system isn't going to evolve very quickly, you can set it at a large amount of time steps. The nice thing about LAMMPS is that if your delay is too large, and I was kind of hoping that 1000 was going to be large enough, I hadn't tested it beforehand. If your delay is large, a system from outside your neighbor list will make it into your interaction range, and that'll crash your system. However, you kind of, the bad thing about LAMMPS is that if that happens, then that'll crash your system. But yeah, I'd expect that you wouldn't need to do that. There we go. Someone says that their neighbor list crashed altogether, which is the behavior I was expecting. And I kind of explained the reason why. The reason that you get that is because a particle from outside your short range cutoff, so if we go back to our picture over here, you have a particle from outside of your neighbor cutoff, making it into your short range. In this case, I used Leonard-Jones because we're using a Leonard-Jones simulation cutoff, and LAMMPS goes, why is this atom even here? And that crashes the system. Cool. Yeah, someone got that one because I was like, oh no, did I mess up the exercise? But I did not. The check setting, so the check setting, if the check setting is yes, then the every and delay settings determine when a build may possibly be performed, but an actual build only occurs if some atoms have moved more than half the skin. Okay, that's quite cool. Interesting one, and I can see how that would. Yeah, that's a nice additional check to make sure that your atoms are moving far enough before you rebuild neighbor lists. Actually, I was going to suggest another way of checking how frequently you should rebuild neighbor lists, which this one I got from Axel Kohlmeier. So before doing this course, we kind of contacted Steve Plimpton and Axel Kohlmeier to ask if there was anything we really should include. And this was one of the things that Axel mentioned. They're both developers, like LAMMPS developers. Is how do you work out how often you need to rebuild your neighbor list? Suggestion is, oh, that's a typo there. That should be a 1. I'll change that in a sec. If you run your system for a short amount of time with a neighbor modify command that says delay 0 every 1 and then check no, then at the end of your simulation, there will be information that's given, that's output about the neighbor list, and you'll get the total number of neighbors, the average number of neighbors per atom, the average special neighbors per atom, and then one right here, the neighbor list builds. And I'm going to change to shell to kind of show a couple of things as well. Is it shared yet? Nope. There we go. Let me. If you go all the way to the bottom of your thing, you get all the information. So you get the performance information, you get the timing breakdowns that we've discussed. You also get this bit here, which is neighbor list informations. And you get a ton of information about it, like total number of neighbors, average neighbor lists, etc., etc. And one of the things that you can do is is it in, I think it's this bit. Which is a shame. But there's essentially a way of looking in here, which I think is local, and then average 128. That sort of tells you how quickly or how often neighbors sort of come in and out. Oh, there it is. It's this one here, which tells you the average value is what you're looking at. Can give you an indication of how frequently you need to update your neighbor list. And in this case, you know that you've run for about 100 for 10,000 time steps, and yeah, actually, I think I misunderstood his email, so I'll read up about it and get back to you after the break for this one. Sorry about that. But I've noticed that actually the initial thing that I thought I'd understood, go back to this bit. There we go. The initial bit that I thought I'd understood there, where it says neighbor list builds, that just tells you the number of neighbor lists that are built rather than how frequently there was a change within the neighbor list. There is something that can be taken from this information, which should let you determine how frequently you need to update your neighbor lists. And I will get back to you after the break about that. Sorry about that, I got it wrong. So moving on quickly, some other tips. The first one is fixing bonds and angles. So far, we've been looking at a molecule which has a number of bonds and angles. Some of those bonds are more interesting than others. So for instance, a number of those bonds will be just like CH bonds, which are probably not doing very much in most cases. Am I showing them? I appear to be showing the wrong screen. Give me a sec. There we go. Cool. Yeah. So a number of the bonds that we've got are, I've termed them boring bonds. And, especially like CH bonds, if you've got large hydrocarbons, are definitely fall in the boring category. They don't really do anything for the physics that you're trying to simulate, but they fluctuate so fast that they effectively end up determining the time step, at which you can run. If there's a way of fixing some of the boring bonds and angles so that they don't fluctuate, then you can get into a situation where you can increase the time step of your simulation. And if you increase the time step of your simulation, then you need to run for less time to get to the interesting stuff, as in less real time to get to the interesting stuff. Or you can, what's the word I'm looking for? Or you can run longer simulation time in the same amount of real time, which are good. LAMMPS offers two methods of restricting these bonds and associated angles. There's the shake and the rattle methods, and those are both fixes that you can use. And with both of those, you can set which bonds and which angle types you want to fix, how you want them to be fixed, and how. And then when the simulation happens, when one of those atoms moves, it'll every time step reconfigure relatively quickly and to a pretty good accuracy. You can set the accuracy within this. It will reconfigure the atom orientations and positions so that all of the atoms within the bond or that make up the bond or the angle are all in the correct orientation. And that can really, really impact the time step you can use. So we're not going to be looking at that because, well, we're already going to be about 5 minutes over, but that's definitely something that you can look into if you have a system with a large number of, what do you call it, large number of bonds that aren't doing anything exciting. And then the next one to talk about is using the hybrid OpenMP plus MPI runs, which we've already kind of covered. But the reason that this is important and the reason that I'm only bringing it up now is that I mentioned before that when you're looking at your timings, let's go back to, where are they? There. You want K-space to be between 10 and 30%. And that if you use too many cores, your K-space will go up. And that's not really quite true, actually. It's not the number of cores you're using that determines how much K-space time you're consuming. It's the number of MPI ranks. If you run in a hybrid MPI plus OpenMP version of LAMMPS, which, by the way, the version of LAMMPS that you will have access to is hybrid MPI OpenMP, then you should be able to reduce the time taken in K-space by effectively reducing the number of MPI ranks, but still running on the same number of cores. So your system should therefore, if everything works, be faster. I've kind of given a quick example of how you can do this, and the things to bear in mind is that all of a sudden, instead of just changing your tasks per node or your -n number, you need to check minus n number and your CPUs per task number, but also you need to find your OMP num threads so that it's to the number to the CPUs per task. And you need to also make sure that this times this is less than 128, but that is something that you can play around with. I've not done an exercise for this because I've not actually had a chance to play around with this too much. So one of the questions in your example, k-space about 3%, is that also a sign that things are inefficient? If causes that. So yeah, that's a great question. Yes, in my example, k-space is about 3%. This is a sign that things are inefficient, and you can quickly tell that the thing that's inefficient is the neighbor time taking 58%. As soon as you reduce that, then the amount of time you're spending computing k-space instead of neighbor time will increase. It's kind of the thing of if you ever reduce any single one of these by themselves, then all of the other ones will go up. Yep. I mean, if your main time is pair time and k-space is hardly anything, I also wouldn't worry too much. Like you're always trying to lower things, and there's certain things you can't really lower, and pair time is one of those really hard ones to lower. So if the one thing that's taking up the most time is the thing the hardest to reduce, then you're doing about as well as you can. Cool. Yeah. The other thing about if you're running MPI plus OpenMP is LAMMPS, a super useful flag called -sfomp. And what that does is it goes through your entire LAMMPS script. And if any of the functionalities you're using, if any of the pair styles, if any of the computes, if any of the fixes have an OMP equivalent, so there's a LJ cut OMP, it'll swap all of those in to make them OMP. And so it'll run as OpenMP. Great. Running hybrid jobs efficiently, though, can also add a layer of complications. And I'm just going to talk about Archer 2 specifically here. But complications, so part of the reason I didn't make this exercise is because I was aware that some of these complications would take too long to discuss and really get into. So I'm just going to breeze over them. But the first one is you need to always make sure that the number of tasks per node and the CPUs per node, so the MPI ranks times the MP threads, need to be less than or equal to the number of cores on a node. You always want to try to restrict the number of OMP threads, OpenMP threads per MPI task, so that it fits on a single socket. Or in Archer 2's case, the sockets, the actual processors are so large that they're each subdivided into a number of NUMA regions. Each Archer 2 node contains 2 processors. Each processor has 4 NUMA regions, and each NUMA region has 16 cores, I think. Hopefully it's not William telling me that's wrong. So you don't want to spread your OpenMP threads for a given MPI rank across multiple NUMA regions or across multiple sockets if you're using a smaller computer. So that's an extra thing you want to take into account. So on Archer 2, you wouldn't want to, I would expect you get a drastic cutoff in how efficiently your jobs run if you're using more than 16 OpenMP processes. I believe I say I was wrong. And to answer the question of what's the maximum number of OMP threads, OpenMP libraries allow you to communicate, or your cores to communicate, but only within a given node, which means the technical largest you use on an Archer 2 node is going to be 128. But you'll never be able to communicate from one node to another with OpenMP. You'll need to use that for that. But as I said, I wouldn't recommend using anything above 16. And the other is you want to make sure that none of your things ever spread across. So if you used I'm going to say silly number, but it's not really that silly. It really depends on your system architecture. But if you use something like 7 on Archer 2, then 7 would mean that you can fit 2 and a bit within a single 16-core NUMA region. And a bit would need to be in a different one. And if you spread across NUMA regions, that increases the communication time, which will decrease the speed of your runs. And then there's another possibility. There's another thing you can use within LAMMPS, which is the relay split method, which is just a different run style that lets you, at the very start of your simulation, define, I want to spend, I'm going to run on, let's call it 100 cores. And I want 20 of those to do K-space and the 80 others to do everything else. It's a bit more involved than that, but that's basically what that lets you do. And that can be useful if you're really, really being limited by your K-space calculations. That's another possible way around it. Cool. So that I will apologize for having overrun by a couple of minutes. That does take us to lunch. I'll stick around for an extra 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions, please do post them in the chat. I'm more than happy to answer them, and I will try to get the answers for the couple of questions that I was not able to answer during this session. And also, I hope that you're all enjoying the course and that you're finding useful information from these.